In this unit, we're going to focus on one of the most critical and risk-laden activities in supply management: supplier evaluation and selection. Every sourcing decision carries long-term implications for cost, quality, reliability, reputation, and resilience. Selecting the right supplier is rarely about finding the cheapest option. It's about balancing risk and value over time. What you'll see throughout this lecture is that supplier selection is not a single decision, but a structured, multi-stage process designed to reduce uncertainty and support strategic objectives. By the end of this unit, you should be able to recognize the 7-stage supplier selection process and explain how it supports world-class sourcing decisions. You'll also gain an appreciation for the information sources supply professionals use to identify and screen suppliers, understand different sourcing strategies and alternatives, and learn what to look for during supplier visits. We'll also examine supplier financial analysis, key evaluation criteria, and close with a discussion of quantitative supplier evaluation tools that allow firms to make defensible, data-driven decisions. There is no single best way to evaluate and select suppliers. Every purchase context is different. The overarching goal, however, is always the same: reduce sourcing risk while maximizing value to the buyer. Supplier selection is often a long-term commitment involving significant resources, internal coordination, and trade-offs. Because of this, organizations increasingly treat supplier selection as a strategic activity rather than a transactional one. Supplier selection begins when an organization recognizes a sourcing need. This could involve a new buy, which requires significant analysis and interaction with internal stakeholders, a modified rebuy, where changes to the existing supply base are needed, or a straight rebuy, which may only require contract renewal or rebidding. A key takeaway here is that effective purchasing organizations anticipate needs rather than react to problems. Proactive sourcing reduces disruption and improves outcomes. When organizations decide how to select suppliers, those decisions typically originate from 3 distinct buying situations: new buys, modified rebuys, and straight rebuys. First, new buys occur when the organization is purchasing something for the first time. These decisions are often triggered by internal user requisitions, the introduction of new products or equipment, entry into new markets, outsourcing initiatives, or even market research tests. Because there is no established supplier relationship, new buys usually require the most analysis and cross-functional involvement. Second, modified rebuys happen when an organization already has suppliers but needs to make changes. This might involve consolidating sourcing, reducing or expanding the supply base, addressing capacity constraints, or responding to supplier performance issues. While there is prior experience to draw from, these decisions still require careful evaluation and often lead to supplier changes or renegotiations. Finally, straight rebuys are the most routine. These involve repeat purchases under existing contracts, often through contract renewals or structured processes like reverse auctions or requests for quotes. Because suppliers and specifications are already known, these decisions tend to be more transactional and efficient. Together, these 3 buying situations explain where supplier selection decisions originate and why some decisions are complex and strategic, while others are routine and operational. Once the need is recognized, the next step is identifying sourcing requirements. These requirements may be driven by internal users, external customers, or broader value chain considerations. Key dimensions often include quality, cost, delivery performance, and service expectations, but their relative importance varies widely by item. This stage determines how much information search and analysis will be required later in the process. At the 3rd stage, firms begin searching for potential suppliers. The extent of the search depends on the purchase requirement, the capability of the existing supply base, and the strategic importance of the item being sourced. High-risk or high-value items justify broader and deeper searches than routine purchases. The following information search strategy matrix helps purchasing professionals decide how much effort to invest in identifying suppliers based on risk and importance. Not every purchase warrants exhaustive global searches, but critical items often do. Organizations rely on a wide range of supplier identification resources. These include trade journals, directories, trade shows, professional associations, internal databases, current and preferred suppliers, sales representatives, internet searches, and supplier-provided information. Over time, firms also build organizational knowledge, which becomes one of the most valuable sourcing assets. The fourth stage is determining a sourcing strategy. There is no single sourcing strategy that satisfies all requirements. Organizations may need to adjust strategies due to changes in market conditions, user preferences, or corporate objectives. This stage involves selecting appropriate sourcing alternatives and addressing critical sourcing issues before narrowing the supplier pool. Key sourcing decisions include whether to purchase from manufacturers or distributors, local versus international suppliers, and whether to use just-in-time or lean support systems. Other considerations include supplier-managed inventory, integrated supply arrangements, purchase volume, storage constraints, and service requirements. Choosing between large and small suppliers involves trade-offs. Large suppliers may offer scale, stability, and breadth of offerings, while smaller suppliers may provide flexibility, innovation, and closer relationships. Dependency risk, geographic coverage, and capability breadth all factor into this decision. Organizations often classify suppliers based on their role, performance, and strategic importance. Let's briefly walk through the most common categories. A preferred supplier is one that consistently meets performance and service expectations. These suppliers are reliable, responsive, and able to handle unexpected changes, making them a go-to option when flexibility and dependability matter. A certified supplier has gone through extensive audits of their quality systems. Certification signals that the supplier can consistently meet or exceed quality requirements with minimal ongoing oversight. A pre-qualified or approved supplier has passed the buyer's initial screening process. They meet baseline requirements and are eligible to be considered for future business, but they are not yet strategic partners. A partnered supplier is part of a small, select group that provides high-value or critical inputs. These relationships are typically long-term, collaborative, and closely aligned with the firm's strategy. A disqualified supplier no longer meets the buyer's standards. These suppliers are excluded from future business until identified issues are corrected and performance improves. A sole source supplier exists when no other approved supplier is acceptable for a specific product or service. This may occur due to unique capabilities, intellectual property, or regulatory constraints. Finally, single versus multiple sourcing refers to a deliberate sourcing strategy. Single sourcing concentrates purchases with one supplier, while multiple sourcing spreads purchases across several suppliers to manage risk and increase flexibility. The supplier categorization stairwell illustrates how relationships evolve over time, from transactional to strategic, as performance, trust, and integration increase. Single sourcing offers benefits such as increased leverage, closer relationships, and value-adding programs like joint process improvement. Multiple sourcing, on the other hand, improves supply assurance, maintains competitive pressure, and reduces dependence on any one supplier. Most organizations use a hybrid approach, depending on risk tolerance and item criticality. Critical issues include the size of the buyer-supplier relationship, risk-reward balance, sustainability and diversity goals, competitors as suppliers, and international sourcing considerations such as countertrade. These issues often extend beyond cost and require executive-level alignment. At Stage 5, organizations reduce the number of suppliers under consideration. Organizations choose a variety of criteria with which to base the limiting of their selection pool. This can include financial risk, operational risk, performance evaluation from prior or existing suppliers, third-party provided information, as well as research conducted internally by going to the supplier and reviewing them on other criteria through site visits. Stage 6 involves selecting evaluation criteria with which suppliers. A detailed evaluation will examine a multitude of factors. These can range from management capability, quality systems, technical expertise, operational controls, financial strength, workforce relations, IT capabilities, and technological sophistication. These criteria help determine not just whether a supplier can perform today, but whether they can remain viable over time. Selection of criteria that matches the company's strategic need without overcomplicating the analysis is important to consider. Financial ratios help to present objective criteria with which to evaluate suppliers. The tables presented below this video will help you not only identify common financial ratios with which to assess suppliers, but also common metrics and ways of interpreting their performance. The final stage involves selecting the supplier and reaching agreement. For routine items, this may involve simple notification and awarding. For complex purchases, it may require extensive negotiation and contract development. Once agreements are finalized, contract management becomes the ongoing focus. In the previous unit, we discussed creating a supplier scorecard based on weighted ratings. Here is one such example of the scorecard approach where a supplier is weighted on several criteria with heavy weights toward delivery performance and technical process capability, followed by general ethics criteria, and finally information systems capability. After assessing the supplier on each of these criteria, they are provided a weighted score that can be leveraged for either comparison of similar suppliers or competing suppliers, or perhaps shared with the supplier for supplier development and continuous improvement. Finally, once a supplier is evaluated and selected, the following is an example of a recommendation form. These are useful to store and keep in place for reducing the cycle time for supplier selection in future dealings. It's important to keep in mind that while the supplier evaluation and selection process is fundamental, the process is also very time-intensive and expensive. Hence, more organizations need to keep in mind the various strategies with which to reduce and optimize the process inputs versus outputs. Organizations can reduce cycle time by mapping current processes, eliminating redundancies, integrating with internal customers, and leveraging technology such as supplier portals and procure-to-pay systems. Third-party providers can also support data collection and analysis. In addition, technology-enabled commodity teams, electronic sourcing tools, supplier categorization systems, and predefined contract language all help streamline supplier evaluation and selection while improving consistency and speed. Let's wrap up by stepping back and reinforcing what you should now be able to do after working through this chapter. First, you should now recognize the 7-stage supplier evaluation and selection process and understand why it matters. Rather than viewing supplier selection as a one-time decision, you've seen how it functions as a structured, sequential process designed to reduce sourcing risk and support long-term value creation. Each stage, from recognizing the sourcing need to selecting the supplier and reaching agreement, builds on the previous one to support more disciplined decision-making. Second, you gained an appreciation for the information sources used to identify potential suppliers. Effective supplier selection depends on combining internal knowledge with external sources, such as trade publications, databases, supplier-provided information, professional networks, and digital tools. You should now understand how the depth and breadth of information search varies depending on the strategic importance and risk of the purchase. Third, you developed an understanding of sourcing alternatives and sourcing strategy decisions. You've seen that there is no single best sourcing strategy and that purchasing professionals must weigh options such as manufacturers versus distributors, local versus international suppliers, large versus small suppliers, and single versus multiple sourcing. These decisions are shaped by market conditions, organizational objectives, and risk tolerance. Fourth, you were exposed to the critical areas analyzed during supplier visits and detailed evaluations. Beyond price and delivery, supplier assessment includes management capability, quality systems, operational controls, workforce relations, technology, and environmental practices. These qualitative insights often reveal risks and opportunities that are not visible in financial or performance data alone. Fifth, you should now be able to identify key criteria used to narrow the supplier selection pool. Through supplier categorization, risk assessment, and performance evaluation, organizations reduce the field of potential suppliers to those best aligned with their strategic and operational requirements. Sixth, you learned about the resources available to support supplier identification and evaluation, including organizational knowledge, supplier portals, third-party providers, and electronic sourcing tools. These resources help firms improve consistency, transparency, and efficiency in the supplier selection process. Seventh, you developed an understanding of why supplier financial analysis is essential. Financial ratios and performance indicators help assess supplier stability and long-term viability, allowing firms to manage financial risk and avoid supply disruptions. Finally, you are introduced to quantitative supplier evaluation and selection tools. You should now understand how weighted scoring models and evaluation surveys allow organizations to compare suppliers objectively, document decisions, and align stakeholders around data-driven outcomes. Taken together, these learning objectives reinforce a central theme of this chapter. Effective supplier evaluation and selection is a strategic capability, not a transactional task. When executed well, it strengthens supply chain resilience, improves performance, and supports sustainable competitive advantage.